You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. On today's show, I'm joined by paranormal investigator and practicing witch, J. Alan Cross. In his latest book, The Witcher's Guide to the Paranormal, Jay breaks down his personal experiences and the best practices to combine and utilise witchcraft with paranormal investigations. We talk cleansing, fractured spirits, haunted houses, witchcraft, poltergeists, as well as meeting a spirit named Clyde, who is clearly more than meets the eye. But before that, as always, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by going to patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as always. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Mastodon, and please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for news, episodes, and more. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So let's join J. Alan Cross as we enter into the realm of the paranormal. On today's show, I'm delighted to welcome J. Alan Cross to Mysteries and Monsters, practicing folk witch and paranormal investigator who works across the Portland area. In his new book, A Witcher's Guide to the Paranormal, Jay prepares you for eerie encounters and how to utilise witchcraft in paranormal encounters. Jay, I am delighted to welcome you to Mysteries and Monsters. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
You are very welcome. You are very welcome. This book that's been released is absolutely jam-packed with tips and knowledge and lessons and exercises. And I suppose, Jay, I'm really intrigued because here we are talking about a book in regards to how we can utilise witchcraft, but some people would automatically presume then that you are a pagan. However, I know you're not. So, how was your journey into this field? What sort of drew you into it? Because often, especially here in the UK, the home of paganism, a lot of people reconnected sort of in the 50s and 60s because they felt kind of lost in regards to how they fitted in the world around them. For you, obviously, as someone with a blended heritage, finding yourself in the northwest corner of the United States, there's a lot going on here, Jay.
It definitely is. Yeah, my journey's been one full of many twists and turns. I was raised Catholic, of course, as you do when you're of Mexican descent a lot of the time. So I was raised Catholic, and then my parents did something that you're really not supposed to do when you're Catholic, and that is get a divorce. That made church a lot more interesting.
Yes.
So it was around that time as well that we were kind of cutting back to being the dreaded Christmas, Easter Catholics, that I also began to realize that something with me wasn't necessarily completely normal.
Mm-hmm.
Not only was I starting to realize that there was a possibility that I was gay, which was also not something that you really see a lot in the Catholic Church being upheld, but also something else was happening. I was having dreams that were of future events, and they would come true. And eventually, too, that led to me also having encounters with spirits of the dead and spirits of actually all kinds of things. So we kind of decided, and it was around the same time too, that my mom was starting to open up to it, and we were on our own at that time with my sister. And so we just decided, you know what, we're just going to not go to church for a while. And it was during that time where I, like many people, went over to paganism, where I felt like I belonged. and fit in a lot better.
Yeah.
And I stayed there for quite a long time until my late 20s. And it's hilarious because, I was always very a pagan's pagan, very anti-Christianity. All of it is evil, like none of it's right, blah, blah, blah. And it was so funny because it was kind of a blend of getting to know my ancestors. And funnily enough, I was devoted to the goddess known as Hecate. And she kind of was like, hey, why don't you come on over here? So a lot of people don't expect that Hecate would bring me back around to Catholicism with the help of my ancestors so much later in life. And so I ended up coming full circle, but I brought with me this years and years and years of paganism and a different understanding of the world and the divine and the spirits that is something that you don't necessarily find in standard traditional Catholicism, which led me to what we call folk Catholicism, or as I like to call it, Christianity plus. Yes, Jesus and Bible and all of that, but we are also not going to say that everything else doesn't exist, because it very clearly does. And in my experience, there's a lot more out there than we are told in church. So it was kind of in the middle of all of that. I was in high school when I began doing paranormal investigation and, doing the witchcraft from such an early age. I started doing it around maybe the age of 9 or 10, is when I kind of got my first book on it. And then it was in middle of high school that I started doing paranormal investigation on my own. And so at that point, it just made sense just to utilize witchcraft and paranormal investigation. Because, it's all energy, spirits are energy. Witchcraft is the movement and directing of energy. And so it all made sense for me to work on their field instead of working in mine, which wasn't going to do a whole lot. So I decided just to combine them. And then it wasn't until later when I got onto a team and started interacting with other investigators that I realized what an anomaly this was. And I thought everybody kind of had this knowledge and information. And I found out that's very, very untrue, which ended up sparking this book. I was like, okay, I have to get out all of this into a book so that other people have it as well, because I was having great success working with the paranormal through witchcraft. But I found that a lot of people were very shocked that I was doing that and thought it was very odd. And I was like, this makes total sense to me.
Well, if it works for you, then so be it. I have to say that my ignorance in regards to the amount of facets there are to the world of witchcraft, it is completely been turned on its head in the last 12 months, Jay. Because if you just said to me 12, 18 months ago, if I would be speaking to somebody and we would be discussing witchcraft or how to utilize it, I would only presume that they would be either a pagan or a Wiccan. It would be as simple as that for me. And yet, since then, I've spoken to several practitioners of witchcraft from a variety of backgrounds and ethnicities and beliefs. And I'm really impressed with this kind of attitude that seems to permeate the field, that it seems to be very inclusive in regards to the fact that people can utilize as much or as little of it as they wish in conjunction with their own personal belief structures, as though, as you mentioned earlier on, it was like Christianity plus. So it seems to be something that can be as malleable as the practitioner wishes it to be and support them however they view their role in life or their belief structure or whichever particular parts of it they wish to utilize and strengthen their own practice. I find that incredibly refreshing and very surprising, I have to say.
It is interesting, but I think that something that witches and paranormal investigators have in common is this idea of searching for the truth and being open to the idea that truth may be different than what we've always been told. And especially when it comes to religion and the spirits and what is out there and what has created and shaped and what watches over this world, I think that the paranormal has really taught me that the truth is always stranger than fiction or what we've been told. And so what I've come to learn over my years of interacting with the divine and with the spirits and things is that anytime that it's posed a question of this or that, is it this way or is it that way? The answer is always both. And always it is both. And that's something that was really difficult for me at first because I was so used to, growing up Catholic, that everything has to be this one way or that one way, or there's this very intense rigidity to it. But my interactions with the divine and with the spirits were always very, they would sometimes be contradictory. Sometimes they would help one another, but sometimes they would also contradict one another. It was, I realized that everything was a lot more complicated. And I think that both paranormal investigators and witches are very much interested in the possibility of what's out there, which allows us to kind of have a little bit more wiggle room as opposed to what we're told is out there versus what we've experienced is out there.
Yeah. I suppose as well, it's very difficult these days because whilst it's probably easier than it's ever been to access information in regards to the world of witchcraft, it's also incredibly daunting because you can fall down numerous holes in regards to which particular practice you follow or who's telling you how to do the rules. Mm-hmm. And the more I speak to people, the more I realize that that's all nonsense. It isn't, as with the paranormal, Jay, it's not a one size fits all. These explanations can't fit everything. And it's, if anything, it's more problematic by going into these situations with that kind of mindset that it has to be this way, as you were referring to earlier. Mm. And if it isn't, then you either ignore it or you just go away from it. And I find that, especially when we're dealing with the paranormal, it's very refreshing to see people these days trying to utilize a variety of approaches to it rather than basing everything they think they need to do on seeing things on television, because I get extremely frustrated. And I've heard you mention this previously when you've been interviewed on other shows, that I'm often really put out by people who seem to have really bad manners when it comes to the paranormal when they're speaking to spirits, as though everybody has to be really aggressive. And I don't understand this because I've spoken to other people, and it's really nice to see that a lot of people are trying to bring back some etiquette and manners when we're dealing with the paranormal, Jay.
Absolutely. And I love to see that happening because we really do get a bad rap, based off of what people see on television. And that was something that I ran into really early on when I started promoting this book in the witchcraft community. I had so many witches who gave me pushback about, teaching paranormal investigation. And I began realizing very quickly that a great deal of witches, first of all, their only experience or education about paranormal investigation comes from these television shows. And a great deal of them also believe that paranormal investigation only happens on and for television. Mm. So I was getting all these comments or responses to, like, on Twitter of people being like, well, why would I want to do paranormal investigation? I have no desire to be on TV. And I'm like, what? Like there's so many paranormal investigation groups out there, and only maybe 0.02% of them are on television. And many of them don't actually want to be on television. Or a lot of people would respond and be like, well, I hate paranormal investigation. I think it's gross. I don't think people should be, antagonizing the spirits. And I'm like, well, neither do I. And in fact, my paranormal investigation team has very strict rules about not antagonizing the spirits and, having this etiquette and having manners. And in fact, most of the teams I've come across have rules in place that if you are not acting in a kind or compassionate manner in these investigations, that you are asked to leave. It's very common for them to have this kind of sensitivity and compassion built in, but you don't see that because that doesn't make for good television. Mm. So a lot of people really think that paranormal investigators are out there just trying to stir up and harass and challenge the spirits to a fight, but that's mostly I find on television. And I mean, of course, you do have those teams where people have just watched the television and then they go out there and try and emulate it. That does happen. But as far as like real educated paranormal investigators go, I really find that to be extremely rare.
Yes. I'm also, I suppose, confused a little bit because as someone that's had a deep interest in the paranormal for a long time, Jay, I want to know when paranormal groups stopped helping people, because often people will go to specific haunted locations or they'll look for cases, not because they want to assist the people that may be suffering a variety of different types of hauntings, but more so to kind of get a tick on their checklist of what they've had to deal with over the years. And yet, when I look back at all the greats over the history of the paranormal, it gets to about the mid-90s, and then all of a sudden they seem to just stop helping people. And I know you've mentioned it in the introductory chapter of the book that you had somebody contact you, and you were obviously too far away to offer them face-to-face assistance, so you tried to reach out to somebody else, and they basically said, well, we can't help them, but we'd like to just go and investigate it. But who does that help other than the people turning up to just have a wander around somebody's house?
Exactly. And that's something that, again, this book was designed to help fight against that a little bit. Because you're right, there kind of did come a turning point where it became more about attempting to find evidence instead of actually trying to understand and do something about it. I'm not a paranormal historian or anything like that, but I would venture to guess that also had something to do with, paranormal television becoming a thing in kind of the late 90s, the 2000s. We suddenly had the, America's Most Haunted and, all those things that suddenly began to show up. And I think that really changed a lot for people, because not only was that most people's only exposure to paranormal investigation, but it became a lot of people's training manual for it. And very much kind of like how social media has changed witchcraft, things that can be shown through this media are the things that are going to get attention. So, for instance, I talk in the book about orbs. With something that we see a lot these days, in paranormal shows and paranormal groups and things like that is, there's a photo with an orb in it. Well, back in the day, orbs were things that we saw in real time with our eyes in a home, like floating through the home. But you can't always translate that to TV. So then it kind of shifted over to photos with orbs in them. And then now that's kind of our only understanding of it these days. So I really do think that television changed a lot, and going in there and being like, I've had people try and like film me for stuff while I'm doing the work that I do. And it's really not that exciting. It's mostly me just kind of walking around, pausing for long periods of time and then muttering to myself and then continuing on. It doesn't make for exciting television. The way that, the theatrical and the photos and the EVPs with the voices on them and stuff like that. So the actual helping part doesn't always translate well to entertainment, which is where it's kind of broadcast to the masses in that sense. So I think most people are trying to find something that will get them some sort of credential, as far as, look, we've found this evidence that is now, going to either prove something or change the way that we feel about it. But I'm starting to realize in the paranormal community, the hurdle or the bar for debunking is set very low. It is set so low that it is simply, if it could have been faked, therefore it is. And if any of us have seen like one of the most recent Avengers movies, when New York or Bosnia or something like that gets absolutely destroyed, we can fake anything on film these days. So the idea that nowadays we are going to actually get anything that's going to convince anybody as far as evidence is concerned is I think at this point kind of a lost cause. So I would like us to come back around to this idea of helping people instead of trying to prove to the world that this is something that exists, because honestly, I don't believe we'll ever get there.
I think it is one of those aspects of it that the reason I would imagine that every paranormal investigation show that's on television is often given a disclaimer that this program is for entertainment purposes only.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I very rarely bother watching anything these days. There's a few I'll watch occasionally, primarily if I know somebody that's in it, or if it's somewhere that I don't know much about, or it's in a country I've not got much of a history in regards to their level of hauntings or some of the stories and events that they've gone on over there, Jay. But often I find myself deeply unsatisfied with it because having done several over the years myself, as you refer to, ghost hunting is a very dull business. It's not really entertaining for anybody other than the people taking part. So it always makes me chuckle when you get a 1 hour kind of greatest hits where everybody's running around the house screaming for 12 hours. Whereas in reality, most of the time you're just kind of, as you say, wandering around, taking things in, seeing what's happening, speaking to the people that might be affected. So it's frustrating that it seems to be more damaging to the pursuit than actually positively promoting it, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Absolutely. It's such a catch-22 because on one hand, I do think that it is broadcasting the wrong idea. And yet at the same time, I think a lot of people would have no idea or no interest in paranormal investigation if it wasn't for the television as well. So it's such this weird double-edged sword where it's like, okay, this is helping kind of broadcast, who we are, but also it's not doing a very good job. I have such mixed feelings about it.
Yeah. For you, as someone that had a very early interest in this then, so did the paranormal investigation come before the interest of witchcraft, Jay? And if so, at what point did you start to think that you could utilise witchcraft to enhance and support your paranormal investigations? Or was it you thought, well, why aren't we doing this? Because I'm really surprised that it's taken this long for witchcraft to come back into the realms of paranormal investigation, because it seems to have been completely pushed out of the way until sort of the last 10 years.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. So for me, I started doing the witchcraft very early. I think I was in like 6th grade when I began actually really doing the witchcraft. And the mediumship psychic thing was happening a little bit before then as well. And so by the time I actually started doing paranormal investigation, I had been both communicating with the dead and practicing witchcraft for several years by that point. So for me, for my very first case, it just made sense to come at paranormal investigation from a witchcraft point of view, because my very first case, I was asked to remove something nasty from somebody's basement. So I knew that if I was going to do that, the best way to go about that would be to utilize spells and magic, because that's what my greatest tool was at that time. And it just made sense to me. And so from my very first investigation, I was utilizing both and doing things like making charms or witch bottles and things like that to put in the space to help protect it, from whatever might want to come back or whatever was in there. So for me, kind of combining my psychic witchcraft lives and then approaching the paranormal through there seemed like a very natural, obvious choice. And I didn't find out until later that it wasn't such an obvious choice.
So when you began to utilize these tools, I'm intrigued as to how you would do a reconnaissance in regards to this, because often these days people just go marching in and they fire up all their tech and they get some torches and they'll leave them on a stair or a bed, and some people will take toys for children ghosts and all kinds of things. And there's always, these weird radio things that people use, which, so I'm intrigued to understand how you would do a recon as a witch in regards to a haunting, Jay, because often, as we see in the modern paranormal investigation, they have a toolkit, and that's it. And that's all they've got. They've got all their equipment. That's all they need. They know what they're going to do and where they're going to do it and how they're going to do it. Whereas I think if you're going into this in the manner of assisting the homeowner who is having a variety of events or experiences, because as we said earlier, it's not a one size fits all. What one person's haunting will be completely different to the next one, I suspect, and often usually is. So for you, in those kinds of situations, how did you kind of decide what you were going to take? Because with the greatest respect, you can't just turn up with a massive bag full of different spells just in case it's such a haunting, because you go, oh, well, I've got one for that in here. Whereas clearly that's just not practical.
You're absolutely right. It is not practical to do that, which is why a great deal of the book focuses on what we call mental magic, which doesn't require a whole lot of tools. So my toolkit that I bring is a very small kind of doctor's bag situation. And that's all I bring with me, because like you said, there's no way that you can bring everything you could possibly ever need. So it's nice to kind of learn how to utilize and move energy and all of that without the tools. But for me, when it comes to doing kind of the investigative portion, for me, it starts outside the home. So right when I pull up, I always tell people, I'm like if I seem a little weird, it's totally fine. Because I'll usually show up and I'll kind of stand outside of the house for a minute before I go in and see if I can hear or sense anything already, like what I might be picking up. And you really have no idea what you're walking into most of the time, because especially on my team, we don't get any information when we first arrive. We just get an address and we just go and show up. And so I've come to houses where I'm standing out front and it sounds like there's a party happening inside because there are so many spirits in there. Others, though, I've come into houses where they have like a energetic protection on them. Mm-hmm. And I'll ask later, like, what is that about? Like, I'm like, it's damaged in portions, but somebody put a protection on the house and they're like, oh yeah, that was our friend who came by and tried to fix it, but it didn't work or whatever. So you really never know what you're going to run into. But I start on the outside and then I go in and of course I greet the family, say hello. And my first question to them is always, is there anywhere in the house that you don't want me to go? Because I think it's important to kind of, respect, as they don't know me. I'm a stranger. I'm just going to be wandering around their house. And the second question is, do you want to know what I find? Because sometimes people are so excited to hear every detail about what I experience in their home and what I feel and what I see and I sense. Other people are like terrified and they're like, no, just take it, go away. And I'm like, okay. So I kind of just check in with them. And then from there, I put my intuition in the driver's seat. So sometimes I already have a spirit that's there trying to talk to me. Sometimes though, I'm just like, I want to go upstairs and I don't know why. And that's why I asked them beforehand, is there anywhere where you don't want me to go? Because I just follow it. And then from there, I kind of get led around the home by my intuition. And I tend to go through the entire house, every room, just to be thorough, but I do kind of prioritize based on where I feel the pull. And that usually brings me to the interesting places pretty quickly. And from there, it'll be a mix of things. So I'm a type of psychic that we call post-cognitive, which means that I see the past and rarely see the future. So I'll be in a space and I'll get information like, oh, there's not necessarily a spirit here, but there was an event here that is energetically influencing the present or has left some sort of an imprint or a stain here. Or I come across spirits and I have conversations with them, which can always be interesting. It's not always the most comfortable for the clients because a lot of the time I come to one of these and I'm like, okay, so how did this start? And they're like, oh, we have no idea. It just started up one day. And I go and I find the spirit. I'm like, hi, I'm here, but you need to leave now. And they're like, oh no, they invited me and they told me that I could stay. And so we have to go back to the family and you're like, so here's the thing. And then I'm like, so is there something that you may have left out? And then they all start kind of like shuffling their feet, kind of looking at the ground. And one person's like, well, the other day there may have been this Ouija board. So it kind of, it depends on what it is that you find. But from there, then I'll, once I'm done walking through and once I have an idea, sometimes I do some drawing, sometimes I write some things down in a notebook that I carry with me. But then I sit down with them and I kind of explain to them, depending on their comfort level, what I found and then what I propose to do at that point. It doesn't take very long, but it can be very telling to walk through the home and sometimes the grounds as well, because sometimes it's not so much the house as it is the land that it's built on. So the investigative portion, I don't tend to use a lot of equipment. Sometimes I'll use something like a pendulum. That can be very helpful, but a lot of it for me is, I guess what they would call extrasensory.
Yeah. Do you find often, because I think the misconception for a lot of people, Jay, is that if people call you in to a haunted location, it's because they want rid of it. And I'm surprised by that, because this seems to be a modern perception once again, that in the modern era, there is this whole attitude that any haunting is dangerous, disruptive, upsetting, destructive. And this seems to be one of those things that seems to have once again, over the last 30 years, come to the fore. Whereas throughout history, most hauntings were quite amiable, I would say. A lot of them were just sort of strange footsteps, doors opening and closing, things moving around. Occasionally people might be startled by bumping into a ghostly spirit moving around their house at certain times or whatever, or strange things or repeated actions. Do you often get people coming forwards not because they want to get rid of it, they either want to understand it or appreciate it more, if that makes sense?
Rarely for the right reasons. Sometimes we do have investigations where, they originally are like, I think I want it gone. I don't know what it is, because people have very low resilience for these kinds of things. And I think it's because of the way we live our lives as modern people, where we're always so busy, and therefore our time at home is so important. This kind of decompressing time is so important and kind of sacred at this point. So if you have to share that time with something spooky happening in your house, it's like, okay, this very limited time where I get to not be at work or out in the world, I need to not have a ghost in it. So I do have some, compassion for that. But at the same time, I have ran into occasions where I come to someone's house because they're like, I don't know, I think it's haunted, something's going on here. And I'm like, oh yeah, so the spirit that I met here is, Jim, who built this house 30 years ago. And that's why you're smelling cigar smoke, because he really likes cigars and just kind of hangs out. And then they find that very endearing and they're like, oh my gosh, Jim, okay. Now that I know, I'm happy to let them stay, if as long as, he wants to stay and all of that. So that does happen occasionally where once people know and that it's not, something scary out to get them, that they become a lot more willing to cohabitate with it. But where I have them that really, and two as well, sometimes you go to like famous haunted locations where they're like, we don't want to fix it because we get tourists based on it. but we do want to see what you find out, because we want more information about it. We want, more stories to tell, things like that, which I think those are always kind of fun as well. As long as the spirits are having a good time, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
But what we do find sometimes, as far as people wanting to keep it, is particularly when we come into this idea of negative entities or entities that are kind of scary or harmful. Sometimes people will have lived with these for a really long time. I'm talking like upwards of 20 years. And sometimes they are attached to them emotionally, even though they say that they don't like it. They're not sure how to live without it, or something feels like it's missing when it's gone.
Yeah.
Or something about having that spiritual presence that interferes with their life makes their life more interesting. Or maybe they feel like it gets them a certain amount of attention or whatever it is. Even though they say they don't like it, they will actively do things to make sure that it stays around. So there have been instances where we've gone in and removed something, but have kind of known as soon as we left, like they seemed like they wanted it back, like almost immediately. And when that happens, they can very much, whether intentional or not, invite it back in. So I do feel like sometimes people can be very attached to the activity, whether it's healthy or not.
Yeah.
People can decide that they very much like it, and whether consciously or not, decide to keep it around.
So a kind of paranormal Stockholm syndrome.
A little bit, yeah. Yeah.
Well, nothing would surprise me, as you say, because I think sometimes people will think, oh, well, this is just how it is. We get used to it. And it's more to do with they have visitors, or certain people won't come to their house because they've had a bad experience. Whereas for them, yeah, it's a pain in the bum, but it's just what it is. And we've been here for ages and we just get used to it. We work around it. So I'm surprised that it's not more common that people will say, oh, well, we want it gone. And yet, as you say, you can tell that they don't really. They just think that that's what they should do.
Yes, that does happen occasionally. I would say it's very much the exception and not the rule. I find most of our cases do want it fixed or resolved in one way or another just to make it stop. But you definitely do come across those that would rather keep it around.
Yeah. I noticed at the beginning of the book, you talk about utilizing intention and will in regards to going into a haunting. Is this something that you've learnt firsthand, that you found yourself unprepared going into a situation, Jay? Because you've got a wonderful quote in this first part of it where you say, even if all you have is a rubber chicken, you need to act and feel as the power of a loaded gun, which I think is one of the best quotes I've seen in a book about witchcraft for a very long time. So is that down to personal experience? That, not that I'm suggesting that you were arrogant or you believe that you could deal with something, but often when we deal with these kind of subjects and we look at paranormal investigations, utilizing witchcraft as a tool in this form, it's all about learning on the job. As we were saying about, it's not a one size fits all. Is it a case of you went in to do an investigation and were kind of put in your place a little bit, or that it was stronger than you anticipated? Or was it just basically common sense that you assumed that you would have to be adaptable and believe in yourself more going forwards?
I think it's a little bit of both, because one of the main tenets of witchcraft is if you're going to make this work, you have to really believe that you can through just sheer force of will. That's kind of one of the main things that is going to fuel the magic. At the same time, growing up, even outside of the realm of paranormal investigation, when you're a young psychic medium, you are kind of inundated daily by spirits that want to talk to you and want to. Me growing up was very much like the film The Sixth Sense. It was very like, okay, and so you have to learn. I'm walking home from school. I don't have a bundle of sage on me or whatever, and there's a spirit that will not leave me alone. So I have to figure out what to do with it with just, my mind and my force of will. So I just kind of day-to-day living I had been confronted with enough encounters that were uncomfortable that I had to figure out. When you're driving down the road, sometimes a spirit just gets in your car with you. And you have to figure out what to do without, tools or stopping or pulling over or things like that. You have to figure out how to do these things on the fly. So luckily, a great deal of me just existing was preparing me for that. But then also similarly, like you're saying, sometimes you go to an investigation and you think you know what you're about to walk into. And then you find out it's something very different that you maybe didn't bring the right things for, or maybe you try something with it that doesn't work. And then you suddenly have to go, that was my only plan here. Now I have to suddenly change it up, and I have very few things in my little bag here. So I think it's a little bit of both, where it's simply learning how to create those boundaries and do things like shove a spirit away or out of my space or out of my car, just, from being alive. And then instances in the actual paranormal investigation arena.
I'm often taken aback when people talk about cleansing. I'm often perplexed that people seem to have a really limited knowledge when it comes to cleansing, because obviously there are loads of different things you can use in regards to cleansing. You can use sound, you can use a variety of different plants, you can use different types of water. So when you're dealing with these kind of aspects and other people who use witchcraft in the paranormal, is it a case of, once again, getting a feel for what it is and trying certain things, or are you able to kind of evaluate what's going to work best based on the kinds of feelings or results that you get in those initial investigations?
It's definitely the second one. My walkthrough really dictates what I do next. So I don't even have a plan until I get there and I can kind of evaluate what's happening. And that's for a couple of reasons, because first, we have the 4 different kinds of hauntings. Each one of them has to be addressed in a different manner or else it won't work. So for instance, like an earthbound spirit, like a ghost, like someone who has died and kind of stayed here on our side, they have to be moved through the light in order to move on. But if you have a residual haunting, which can sometimes look like a ghost, like, we hear those stories like, every night at 3 a.m., the woman in white, walks down the hallway. That's not an actual spirit. It's a memory. It's an energy that's caught in the space.
Yeah.
Like that's replaying over and over again like a tape. And so you can't send that through the light. There's nothing actually there, but you do have to kind of lift it out of the actual physical space itself. So depending on what you run into, you're going to have to address it in a very different way. Similarly, the temperament of what you're dealing with sometimes will dictate what you have to do. So sometimes I, run across, let's say, a human earthbound spirit that I have to move through the light, but they'll be very, very agitated and maybe aggressive. And so something that I might have to do beforehand is I might have to go through the home with something like rose water and sprinkle it around the house. And that is cleansing. It's not going to remove them from the space, but it does help them calm down a lot and brings a very peaceful vibration to it. And then sometimes I can, at that point, have a conversation with them. Or sometimes too, you run into a spirit that is a human spirit, but they are trapped in their own memory, reliving it over and over again, and they can't see you or interact with you. But sometimes if you hit them with like cleansing smoke or something like that, it will kind of snap them out of it, and then you can talk to them. So it really depends on what it is that you find as well.
Have you found situations where you've had to use other talented people to support you? Because often there always used to be this perception that there was one Claire, and that was clairvoyance. And yet, the more I speak to people, the more I learn, you realize that there are 4 key ones, which are clairaudience, clairsentience, and claircognizance. So, on top of clairvoyance. So, have you had a situation where you've had to utilize people who are more clairaudient to assist in a haunting investigation? Or is it sometimes that you will know or hear from the people who are dealing with the haunted location that it is a specific type, and therefore you might reach out to someone who has a talent in that particular aspect?
Absolutely. So I am very lucky in the fact that I am one of several psychic mediums with spiritual backgrounds on my team. So and we're a bit of an anomaly because we're mostly made up of psychic mediums, as opposed to other investigation teams that are mostly investigators that may have like one investigator that's a sensitive, or maybe they have like a psychic that they bring in sometimes. So I actually work with a whole team of people that is very spiritually aware, and they all kind of have some of their own techniques as well that they've developed that I've gotten to learn from them as well. So I very much like to work in tandem with people, and we are sometimes selected on the case depending on our skill set so that we can work together. So, kind of like if there's, scary, gnarly, beastie things, they usually add me to the case. But if there is something else, they might, add one of the other investigators or psychics to the case. So I do get to work with many talented people who sometimes I'm like, what? I can't figure out what is in that closet. Can you go check? And then they go check and they come back and they're like, oh yeah, I was able to talk with it. Because sometimes too, spirits won't want to talk with you simply because of who you are. Sometimes you run into racist or homophobic spirits. It does happen. Or sometimes you look like someone that they don't like. Or sometimes the opposite. I have one of those faces where people are constantly coming up to me thinking that I'm somebody that they know and trying to talk to me. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't know you. And that translates into the spirit world as well. I'll have spirits show up like in my house or out and about, and they're like, "Oh, hey, Tony, I need you to do this." And I'm like, I'm not Tony. So spirits will have different reactions to different people for different reasons. And so I really like being able to work with other mediums so that if I'm like, you know what, I'm falling short here, can you go take a whack at that? They can, and usually have more success than I do. And I really appreciate being able to have those kinds of people to lean on that I can trust and know that they're going to do a good job as well.
Have you ever gone into a haunting or dealt with a case, Jay, where you've gone in and had a specific impression and thought, oh, well, look like we're dealing with this. And then when you've started to kind of attack it, not necessarily in that kind of full-on way, as in rather going at the case rather than whatever the haunting is. Have you ever had a situation where it suddenly turned everything on its head and you're like, hang on a minute, this isn't what we thought it was, or this wasn't what it gave the impression it was?
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the reasons why it's very dangerous to think that you know everything about the paranormal. Or I think the most dangerous phrase any investigator can say is, oh, well, I've seen everything. Because as soon as you say that, the paranormal will flip itself inside out and show you something completely different that you've never seen before. So one time, not that long ago, I had actually been asked by a different paranormal investigation team to go with them to a fairly well-known haunted location around here. And we get there, and in the basement of this home is a natural spring, which is very neat. But it's also, as a paranormal investigator, as soon as anyone's like, oh yeah, there's some sort of water situation in the basement, you're like, oh, that's where Satan is. Because, anytime there's like a cistern or a well or something, it's like, oh no. But we go down there and I'm there with several psychics, and there's this very distinct impression that there are what we call like water elementals. And for kind of a lack of a better term, they're kind of like water fairies, essentially. They kind of were living there in that space. And among them was living down there in this basement, kind of off to the side in this dark corner, was what we had believed to be a human spirit that had been there for a very long time. So when human spirits stay here on our side for too long without passing through the light and moving on, they can undergo a bit of a change and kind of end up sort of warping and twisting over the years into something that is eventually unhuman. And this spirit was pretty far gone into that transition. And the water spirits had kind of adopted it and had kind of like been like, hey, like just kind of like be one of us. And my impression of this spirit was very much that they had kind of like decorated it with like, like moss and stuff, like, like, oh, hey, you're one of us. Like, and so it was a very odd spirit to come across. And so we had so much compassion for it. We're like, oh my gosh, this is a spirit that, has been stuck here for so long that it's barely even a human anymore. Let's see if we can get it through the light so that it can, be healed and go to where it's supposed to be instead of being stuck here. And I outsourced. I called my friend Anwyn Avalon, who does water witchcraft and specializes in wells and springs and things like that. I'm like, hey, there are these creatures, these water spirits that are here. And this is kind of the situation, since it's one of their friends, are they going to be mad at us, if we try and move it on or whatever? And she gave us some really great advice about kind of bargaining with them to kind of see if we're kind of brokering the release of the spirit so that we can move it on through the light. So we go through this whole thing where we bring these spirits some offerings and stuff. And we're like, do you mind if we take this spirit from you and help move it on through the light? And their response is kind of like, sure. And we're like, oh, I don't don't like that they seemed really amused by that. And so we're like, okay, like we're immediately like, something's weird here, but all right. And so we go back over to this spirit that we're trying to help through, and through both psychic sense, and we were working with an ovulus at that time as well. It kind of starts to laugh at us because there's a different type of spirit that I kind of refer to as a mimic that likes to pretend to be other spirits. And that's what this thing was. And it suddenly had this big like gotcha moment after we had like given a bunch of stuff to the sprite, and then like this very uncomfy spirit suddenly was just kind of like, got you. You totally thought I was the spirit. And we're like, we were just had this very nasty feeling suddenly as soon as it did that. We're like, oh, hate that. And so we ended up going back upstairs, like, hate all of you. How dare you? So yeah, that was one where I was like, oh, I did not see that one coming actually. So it was a good learning moment.
Well, I'm very surprised that we don't get more layered hauntings, Jay, because often there is this perception that if you go to a haunted home or a location or a business or a specific area, that it will be one particular type. And yet, if you look through history, there are always certain places where they always will say, well, we've got 3 or 4 different types of ghosts. We might have a residual. We might have a poltergeist. We might have some kind of horrible, scary thing that lives in the cellar. So is that as rare as it seems? Because often when you look back at some of the more famous locations throughout the world, they seem to have one of everything. It's like they've got their little paranormal checklist and they've gone, yeah, famous ghost, yes. Spirit of somebody who died horribly. Child ghost locked in a room. Yeah, got one of them. Yeah, we've got a poltergeist in the kitchen. And then we've got some strange monster that lurks around the basement.
Absolutely. I actually do feel that quite a few hauntings are layered. It's very rare that I come to a home that has absolutely nothing going on except for one thing in particular. Sometimes that does happen, but I do find that most places, even if the other ones aren't causing a problem, can still be present. So for instance, maybe people will call me because they're experiencing symptoms of like a negative entity haunting. And that very much is the only real problem in the home. But then I walk into their kitchen and there's some spirit of some dude making a sandwich. And I'm like, hi. And they're like, oh, sorry, I just kind of hang out here. Don't worry about it. Like, but the family isn't picking up on them, but they are still there. Or there will be something like residual, something happening with the land or in one of the rooms that again isn't really necessarily the problem that they're picking up on, but is still part of what's going on there. So I tend to treat as much of this holistically as possible, where I don't just treat like the main issue, but I kind of go and I'm like, okay, yes, that is the main issue. We do need to address that, but also someone died in your bathtub years ago and they're not still there, but like that event is still there. So we're going to like get rid of that too. So a lot of the times these hauntings are layered, but people don't always pick up the different layers are not always the problem, if that makes sense.
I was very intrigued by the section talking about fracturing, because I think fracturing is one of those things that often we see this mentioned in scary movies, that Poltergeist is a prime example of this. Without actually saying what it was doing, is probably the best cinematic example of fracturing I can think of off the top of my head, Jay, where somebody comes in, they clean it all up, everybody goes, oh, this is amazing. And then obviously it just gets a lot worse, because whatever's been left behind is the very worst remnants of whatever has been passed on. And so for me, it's quite surprising that more people aren't aware of this particular facet of the paranormal, because I think it's one of those things that people just don't think about that often, because it doesn't seem to happen that often. It's quite rare. And I think that tends to deal with more to do with the personality of the haunting, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So in regards to fracturing, is that something you've come across often, or as I prescribe, it is a rare event, but if anything, it's probably worse than the original problem?
Sometimes it definitely can be. So fracturing, for those who are listening. Fracturing is my term for something that happens where when you send a human spirit through the light like they're supposed to, sometimes part of them is rejected by the light or splits off from them. So a lot of the times where we see this is if the ghost was a human that dealt with addiction or mental illness. When they go through the light, and even when they're alive, people who are going through addiction or mental illness, people will often say things like, oh, they seem like two different people. Like there's a person that I know and love when they are, clean and sober, and then the person they are when they're using is so very different. Or the person they are when they're on their medication versus when they're not. And so what kind of happens is someone will say who was an addict, they will remain an addict when they're on this side of the light. But then once they go through it, it will sort of peel off of them. Their addiction, that separate personality will pull off of them, because that's not really who they are as a person. That's something that they've acquired in this life that is kind of turned into a spirit of its own or another personality, sort of. And so when they go through the light, that part will sort of peel off of them. And it's not always that big. Sometimes it's very small. Sometimes it's their depression, or sometimes it's some anger that they've held on to that comes off of them. So sometimes in very, very big cases, when that part splits off, it almost comes off as its own spirit that is then separated. And that can cause a lot of problems because, when they were together, there was that other part kind of wrangling it a little bit. But then once that good part, that their humanity kind of part goes through the light, and all that's left is who they were, as an addict with nothing to, create a conscience or anything like that around it, it can cause a lot of issues. Whereas someone who held on to a lot of anger about something and that sort of cleansed from them, it can leave off like this very small piece. So I do think it does happen more often than we think, but it's not always very noticeable, because sometimes that little small piece comes off and doesn't really do anything. It just kind of sits there. But those small pieces too can eventually find other small pieces and kind of build themselves up into this other spirit. So fracturing is, I think, kind of a lawless situation in a lot of ways. It just does kind of whatever it wants. But yeah, I do think it happens more often than we would think, but it's not always so dramatic that we recognize it. Sometimes it's very small and doesn't really cause any problems at all. So we don't notice it.
It's always interesting for me that people will always explain that kind of response to a cleansing as, oh, well, something's filled the space. And I think it's not always that simple. It's usually something's been left behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
I was delighted to see as well in the bit where you talk about poltergeists, Jay, that one of my biggest bugbears is when people say, oh yeah, poltergeists, they all affect teenage girls. Yes, a large proportion of them do involve prepubescent, pubescent teenagers, a lot of whom are female. However, I know enough about the poltergeist phenomenon to know that it can affect all kinds of people. And I know you refer to an example in your book where you went to a family of adults who were all related and forced into clearly a very tense family dynamic through necessity more than anything else. And it was the friction of their situation that was creating this energy, because I'm a big believer in the poltergeist phenomenon being some kind of battery-driven phenomenon more than anything. It requires some form of energy through a variety of scenarios. We all know how difficult life can be sometimes, and often people in situations of great stress or difficulty will sometimes find themselves having to then deal with strange things going on in their homes, Jay. For you, is that one of those things that the more you've done it, the more you've come across the different types of environments that can feed a poltergeist?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And you get to know the different kinds of people that can create them as well. So for me, I definitely notice it's the poltergeist and really helps me understand this idea that poltergeists are created by people and that they aren't spirits. And that's something that a lot of people don't understand or know about. Even now, I'll go to like paranormal conferences and someone will be teaching up on stage and be like, oh yes, a poltergeist is the angry spirit of someone who had a bad death. And I'm like, no, what are we doing here? Because when I go into these homes, I can feel an energy and they'll be telling me about the activity that's been happening, but I don't find any spirits. And then that's when I'm like, oh, okay, so this must be happening. But yeah, you do come across the different ways in which this can happen. And I do agree that, a lot of the time it is, young people, particularly very bright, adolescent or teenage girls. And that's something too that I make note of. So when someone's like, oh yeah, we're having all this activity, I'm like, do you got kids? And they're like, oh yeah, we have $3. They're 10, 11, and 12. And I'm like, oh, okay. But at the same time as well, I've seen it like you're talking about, families that are very disrupted all together, creating it, as well as grown adult people, even adult men, women, whoever, who create it when they're going through very difficult life issues, such as divorce, deaths of family or loved ones. They will create it. And something that I very much notice is there is a very distinct difference between poltergeist activity that is caused by children and poltergeist activity that is caused by adults. Because the children created poltergeists are often very mischievous. They like to do things like hide things, move things around, write rude words on the walls with strange substances, things like that. It's all very mischievous. It all seems like pranks very much. But when it's created by adults, there is a quality to it that is so much more sinister. Because when children, in order to really get a poltergeist agent to start producing a poltergeist, you have to put them under a lot of pressure. So when they're young people, it tends to be things like academic pressure, pressure from parents, going through things like a divorce, things like that. And so where a child is repressed like that, what they really want to do is they want to act out with rude behavior. And so that's what the activity is like. But when you're an adult, we have so much more baggage, and the things that are putting pressure on us are so much bigger and scarier. There are things like medical diagnoses that we're not ready to handle, or, deaths of people that we really loved. These are very dark, overwhelming feelings that are putting pressure on us. And we as adults don't often want to just, act out and, do something that's going to, upset our parents or whatever. It's a lot different. It's a lot darker. So I find that poltergeists, created by adults are very different than those created by young people.
Have you had a situation where you've dealt with something that seems to be a bit of both? Because there are some notorious poltergeist cases where it seems to switch between the childlike mischievousness and mucking around to extreme acts of violence or causing severe damage, which kinds of, for me, I've often thought that when we deal about these kind of cases, Jay, often they will focus on the younger members of a disrupted situation, as you refer to there, that if a family are going through a divorce or some kind of parental stress, yes, it's going to affect the children, that's obvious, but we often seem to completely disregard how the parent in that situation must be feeling and what they're going through, because you'll have the breakdown of a relationship, you'll have the financial implications, the stress of perhaps maybe losing your home, dealing with looking after the children entirely on your own. And yet, when we deal with these cases, everybody thinks, oh, well, it's the kids that are really upset about everything. And we don't seem to, or certainly some people don't seem to put any credence in the fact that it might be the parent that's also feeding into this, that causes this kind of pendulum swing from cheeky behavior to violent behavior. Because often certain poltergeists, there seems to be, people will think it's some kind of sort of momentum where it starts off slowly and does silly things to then causing physical damage to the property or pushing people about and scratchings and slappings and things being thrown all over the place, to pools of water appearing from nowhere, to strange substances being smeared across walls and things, which is never a nice situation to find yourself in, I suspect, because then you begin to think, what on earth's done that? And that kind of causes even more stress as well. So I often think that sometimes the reactions from these kind of situations causes the emotional response from the people who are suffering it, which in turn generates more energy, does it not?
I do think that there is something to be said about that. So, but I also think there's, again, always the answer to, is it this or that questions? It's always both, all of them. So for instance, one of the most documented, talked about famous poltergeist cases is, the Enfield poltergeist.
Yeah.
And little Janet. I have wondered for a while if her mother wasn't also a contributing poltergeist agent, because when they describe Mrs. Hodgson, she's always described as being very intelligent, a bit of a pit bull, someone who is very strong-willed, very bright. I remember reading one of the accounts where they had to keep giving her things to do, otherwise, because she wasn't left to her own devices very well. She would get into stuff. So that's very much a description that you would find with people who are poltergeist agents. And I do think that these people can be, these things can be passed down in family lineage the same way that, any sort of supernatural ability can be passed down. So it wouldn't surprise me if there was a connection there. And she herself was under a lot of stress at that point. She was a single mother. Her husband had just left. They had nothing. She was trying to support the family. She had, several unruly children. It wouldn't surprise me if she was also part of that. At the same time, I also think that we can have multiple haunting scenarios. And I do believe that in certain instances, different spirits or entities can utilize a poltergeist as a cover for their presence so that they can get into the home, set up shop, and kind of make a home there and kind of get going themselves and go undetected because their activity is believed to be part of the poltergeist. So I have seen them kind of utilize that as a bit of a cover, like a bit of a camouflage, to go in and get themselves established. And so sometimes you do have poltergeist activity and something like negative entity hauntings at the same time. Now, that being said, I think that the reverse can be true as well, where sometimes a negative entity haunting can be so bad that it itself creates the pressure that causes the poltergeist agent to begin producing activity. It's kind of that haunted house movie trope where you get there and the whole family is sleeping together in the living room. It's that I've actually come across that before. And that is a great deal of fear and pressure and anxiety to put on people, especially if they have young people in their house. So I think that something like a haunting can be just as triggering for a poltergeist agent as something like a divorce or academic pressure or something like that, that's going to get them to start producing activity. So I think that we need to remain open-minded to the possibilities of either there's more than one poltergeist activity, maybe it's one of the parents and one of the kids, or there's multiple hauntings happening at the same time. Because sometimes the haunting does seem to have two different personalities. And when that happens, I think we do need to say, okay, there's two different sources for this, whether they're both poltergeists or not, two different things are operating at once here.
I think often the thing about the Enfield poltergeist they always overlook is that they just look at the mum and the three children who are in the house. But it seems that they don't seem to sort of put much stock in the fact that the husband had left them for another woman, and he would often come to the house with his other woman. And also they had another son who was in a special education unit due to the challenges he had. And it surprises me that outside of the investigation that Gross and Playfair did, nobody else really focuses on any of those aspects. They just go, oh, well, it was all based on Janet. And you think, well, there's a lot more to it than that. I think it's very simple to just focus on the kids that were there, the three of them, and not everything else that was going on around them. Because as you say there, Jay, I think there was a lot of different ingredients in that particular case that was causing a variety of friction to fire different things up at different points.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm always asking people when they investigate hauntings. One of my favorite aspects of the paranormal is animal ghosts. Jay, have you ever had a situation where you've had to visit a location? And often we will hear about, as we've mentioned earlier, mimics that pretend to be something else to kind of trick people or investigators. Have you ever had to deal with a haunting that is of an animal, or people believe they have an animal spirit wandering their property?
I have, and animals do occasionally kind of show up in this work, and it's always such a mixed bag, because I find that the earthly animals that we're used to, cats, dogs, horses, deer, all those things that we're used to having around us, they have such a better understanding of death and the spirit world and all these things. My mother is an animal communicator, so she's always told me about things like, oh yeah, they understand, they remember their past lives, all this stuff, they get it. So for them, crossing over really is not a difficult trip. And so we rarely have ghosts haunting places that are these earthly animals. That being said, there are some kind of, I guess, spectral animal spirits that aren't dead animals so much as they are representative, if that makes sense. So for instance, I was working this house once where someone was having me read it, where there was this big black dog that roamed around the edge of the property all the time. But it wasn't a normal dog. It was like a spirit entity in the form of a dog. And sometimes people would say that they would see it. Sometimes it would show up in pictures, things like that. But it would kind of roam around the edge of the property. And I got this very distinct feeling that at some point, someone who had been residing in the house had been some sort of a witch or some sort of a worker. And it was theirs that was set to guard the property and kind of remain there after this person had died. So it wasn't like a big black dog that had been here and then died and stayed. It was a spirit entity that was a big black dog. So we see things like that with a decent amount of frequency, but it's not very usual to have a full-time haunting caused by a pet. They will often come back and say hello, particularly in the week or so after their death. People will be like, oh, I swear I heard them, their little toenails following me around, like my chihuahua used to do or whatever. They'll have those experiences, which I very much think are real, them showing up and kind of being like, hi, I just want you to know everything's cool. But as far as real ongoing hauntings, I don't find them to be so much of animals as they are spirit entities that are in the form of certain animals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, obviously here, we used to be inundated with big black dogs running everywhere. So I'm not surprised that people still have such encounters, or you may encounter such things, because obviously people are still reporting encounters of we tend to sort of group them under one name, which is the shut. But obviously different areas of the UK have their own specific names for them all over the places. Like Padfoot and Barghasts, and depends whereabouts you are in the UK. So I'm always interested to hear that these reports still occur in North America as well as over here, Jay. It's not just kept in home, as it were.
Indeed. Things definitely migrate on occasion.
I think the last aspect I want to touch on before I let you go, Jay, and thank you so much for such a thoughtful and an interesting conversation, is Clyde, the top hat man. So for anybody who's yet to read your book, without wishing to spoil this particular part, I have to say it made me chuckle when I read your introduction to this. Who is Clyde, and how did you meet them?
Clyde. So Clyde is at this point a bit of a frenemy. I don't, not quite a nemesis, but also not quite someone I would invite over for tea. Clyde is a spirit that I met while investigating a bar in downtown Portland. And I first noticed him when I arrived to the bar, and I meet the managers during the day, so the bar is closed and it's just us. And I practice a very hard and fast rule when it comes to paranormal investigation that I take very seriously. And that rule is paranormal starts with P. So you always go to the bathroom before you start your paranormal investigation. Because that's very important. You never know what's going to show up, and you don't want to be wetting yourself. So I excuse myself to use the little investigator's room there. And of course, it's a Portland bar bathroom. So it looks like the inside of Courtney Love's mind. And I'm in my business, and I'm at the sink, and I'm washing my hands, and there's this little mirror above it. As I'm washing my hands, I look up into the mirror, and there's this man standing behind me. And I mean, speaking of Courtney Love, it looked a little bit like, I would describe it in this particular instance, he looked a bit like Kurt Cobain near the end, except for he was wearing a full tuxedo and tails with a top hat and like gloves, spats, the whole thing. And so I see him and I'm like, oh, hi. And then he's gone. And I come out of the bathroom, and I have a very expressive face. I must have had something going on, because I come out of the bathroom and the manager looks up at me and goes, oh, you saw him, didn't you? And I was like, yeah, I did. And she's like, he loves to do that. You saw him in the mirror, didn't you? She's like, because a lot of the guests, people talk about seeing someone. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what happened. And so I kind of, do my thing. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to walk around a little bit, see what I can find. And I kind of go upstairs to where they have the green room, which is literally, to get into the green room, it's a hole in a brick wall that you crawl through to get into the place where like bands and stuff would hang out, maybe before and after the show. And I'm in there, and I'm kind of like, just kind of talking to myself. I'm just like, hey, if there's anybody here, you want to make yourself known, you want to have a chat real quick. Suddenly he shows up again. And I'm like, okay, like I've come across a lot of weird stuff, but this is the first time I've ever had a spirit that is that well dressed. I'm talking, and in this particular instance too, the tuxedo was purple, which was really intense. I was like, okay, Batman villain level here. Top hat, the whole thing. And as I'm talking with him briefly, I begin to realize that his skin doesn't fit right. Like it's almost like he's wearing a skin suit, or so what I've kind of been comparing it to is like the first Men in Black movie, when the alien's in the farmer and he keeps having to kind of like adjust himself. Yeah. I'm realizing it kind of has that sort of thing going on. And so I go, oh, you're not a human spirit, are you? And as soon as I said it, everything kind of changed. Like his eyes turned yellow, and I could tell that he was in a way almost proud of me that I had figured it out. Mm-hmm. And he gives me this big smile that stretches way too far. And inside he has all these shark teeth, like rows and rows and rows of shark teeth. And I'm like, okay, no, I hate that. And let's not. And so I end up doing my thing, kind of, I get rid of him. And they actually showed me later, there was footage that they had from the security camera of when I got rid of him. There's like this little like anomaly on the film that goes down the stairs and out the front door, which was very weird. So I get rid of him and I'm like, okay, cool. That was weird, but all in a day's work. And then I realized that he's showing up, or a spirit like him fitting that same description is showing up at several other of our cases. And then I'd have people send me an email that's like, hey, I had this spirit that's in my home of this tall, thin guy in a very nice tuxedo and like a top hat, or sometimes it's a bowler's hat, that's like in my house. And they always have the same description. They're always tall, thin men wearing a very nice outfit, a very nice hat. And there's generally something wrong in the mouth teeth area. Either they have really sharp teeth, or sometimes they have like no lower jaw and a really long tongue, or things like that. And so I just started referring to this kind of type of spirit as Clyde, because number one, I didn't have another name for it, so I just made one up. And I find that if you give them like a very normal, not scary name, you don't call them Pazuzu, you call them like Fred, whatever, because that helps make them a lot less scary.
Yes.
And so I just kind of started naming it. But after a while, there had been so many instances of either running into him in cases or hearing about him from other people that one day I just sat down and was like, clearly I'm not the only one. So I just Googled like spirit of man in hat. And then like, boom, pages and pages and pages and pages all about this spirit that everyone was calling the Hat Man. And there are books written about the Hat Man. And there are all these encounters and blogs and, Reddit threads and things like that of people who have been having encounters with this all over the world. And I even found too that I believe it's the Seneca Nation that has a old legend about a spirit that they called High Hat that wore a stovepipe hat and was an eater of flesh. So he had the scary teeth, and something that they would do is they would go like out and they would leave meat. They'd like nail it to trees and stuff like that where he was presumed to live so that he would stay there and wouldn't have to come into the village looking for tea. And I was like, oh, okay. So this is a thing. Like, this is not just me having, a spirit that has showed up more than once. This is a type of spirit that very much exists all over and that a lot of people have had encounters with.
Were you sort of concerned? Because, obviously people will sometimes say when you deal with paranormal investigations and deal with cleansings, occasionally things will become tethered to you, whether you want them or not, regardless of how experienced you are, Jay. Was it that kind of situation where you thought, hang on a minute, this thing seems to be quite keen on me?
In a way, it wasn't necessarily so personal as I feel possibly big picture. I did have a very strange encounter with him a couple years ago. I was actually just hanging out, having dinner at my mom's house when suddenly I looked down the hallway and he's sitting on her bed in her room. And at first I was like, no, maybe I'm just having anxiety, whatever. But then my dog was like looking directly at it too. And I was like, okay, like we're going to be like really chill here. I'm just going to go back here into this room real quick. And I went back there and was like, what are you doing here? Like, you are not supposed to be here. Like, how dare you come into my mother's house? Like, I'm ready to go back there and fight. And he's very calm. And he just goes, you haven't been investigating lately. And I hadn't. It had been quite a while since I had actually gone to the home and done anything. And he was there to challenge me to continue. And that was a very odd moment where I was like, shouldn't you be like, no, don't go back there and keep making us leave places? Like, like you would think that they would want me to not be doing what I do.
Yeah.
But he was kind of there to make sure that I wasn't getting soft, And that was a very weird encounter with him. And then he left and didn't come back after we had that conversation.
That is remarkable. How peculiar.
It was very weird.
Yeah.
I actually haven't told anybody that story.
Well, thank you for sharing it, Jay. Thank you. As I said, before you gave us all the heebie-jeebies there with these strange skinny men in lovely suits turning up unsuspectingly, where can everybody get a copy of the book and follow your work going forwards, my friend?
Absolutely. So you can find the book all over the place. You can find it on Amazon. You can get it from the Llewellyn website. Llewellyn is the publisher. So you can get it through them. Also, of course, you can and should support your local metaphysical and other independent bookstores. So feel free to go into those places, order, if they don't have it, you can request that they have it. Or I'm not sure how the library systems work in the UK, but I know that over here you can request that they carry a copy in the library so that other people can also have access to it in a way that doesn't cost them a whole lot of money. So that's great ways to find it and kind of learn along with me. I did realize later, I don't get told these things. They just kind of happen. And then someone tells me, they're like, oh, I loved your book on Audible. So apparently there is an audiobook version that is available now. And I did get to listen to it. The guy who narrates it does a great job. So that's available as well. So if you're not really a reading person, but are an audiobook person, that is available. And you can, of course, always find me on Instagram. I am at Oregon_wood_witch. So it's Oregon Wood Witch. Make sure it's spelled correctly and has the correct number of underscores, because there are several people out there pretending to be me at the moment. And I will never message you to offer you a reading. If that happens, that is not me. Block them and move on.
Fantastic. Well, I'll put links to everything in the show notes for the book and your social media. We'll make sure it's the right one, Jay. And all I can say is thank you again for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating and a lovely chance to have a deep and insightful conversation about you, your work and your life. So thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me.